Hi, and welcome to the Heroes, Villains, and Sidekicks show. Today we're going to be looking at one of my favorite characters from a television program, and that is Mr. Spock from Star Trek. And that's what we'll be doing here on the Heroes, Villains, and Sidekicks show. We'll be learning and talking about the origins and backstories of heroes, villains, and sidekicks throughout the comic book universe and pop culture. We'll look at both popular and obscure characters that you may have never heard of, but I think you'll really dig. Now, I am a huge Star Trek fan. Now, I love Star Wars. I love, obviously, all different types of sci-fi, but Star Trek holds a special place in my heart. It's probably my favorite franchise. And Mr. Spock, or just Spock as I'll probably be calling him throughout this, is probably one of my favorite characters in the whole franchise. Definitely in the original series. But, Leonard Nimoy just really did a great job with the role, and he's just one of my favorite characters. So let's learn a little bit about him. Well, Mr. Spock, he is a half-Vulcan, half-human science officer, and he is aboard the USS Enterprise, and he was played by Leonard Nimoy throughout the whole Star Trek franchise. And that includes the original series, all 8 movies, even the animated series, and into the new reboot that J.J. Abrams did. Oh, and of course he was in a couple episodes of Star Trek The Next Generation. So he has been in pretty much almost every iteration of Star Trek that has been out there. So a brief overview, Spock begins his career in Starfleet as a science officer, then moves up into a command position as the series progresses into the movies, and then he retires actually, and he becomes the Federation ambassador, helping to bridge the distance between different races and galaxies throughout the culture. So it is a broad range, a broad sort of summary of Spock's career in Starfleet, and now let's go into it in a little bit of detail, because it's just really cool. And we will be looking at the origins of Spock from the original series and up through really to the last of the movies that the original cast starred in. We will also touch on what is known as the Kelvin timeline. See, when J.J. Abrams rebooted the Star Trek franchise, he and the studio took things in a really different direction. They changed the timeline of the Star Trek universe and the trajectory pretty much of all the characters. Now, it's called the Kelvin timeline because the starship Kelvin was the first to encounter the Romulan ship that caused the new Star Trek timeline. But more on that later. And since we'll be talking about this character and plot points in the Star Trek original series, Next Generation, all the movies, and the new movies, there of course will be spoilers present in this podcast. Spock was born on the planet Vulcan and is a son of the Vulcan Sarek and the human woman Amanda Grayson. Now, he had a pretty rough childhood. He was the only child. He did have a stepbrother named Sybok for a while, but he was, of course, banished later on for not abandoning his emotions. We see him in one of the Star Trek movies, probably one of the worst Star Trek movies. I won't even say its name. It was that horrible. But Spock had a really rough childhood. Now, of course, he was tormented by the other children for being of a mixed blood. He was half human, half Vulcan, and they would always taunt him and try to make him show emotion, which is, one of the biggest taboos on their planet. Now, Vulcans have striven to purge all emotion from their being, to be beings of pure logic and reason. But it doesn't mean they don't have emotions. Vulcans do have emotions, but through meditation and training and rituals, they have learned to subdue their emotions and let logic and reason overpower those emotions. But Spock, being half human, he's always at war. This emotional half, he's always fighting with the Vulcan half. It's obviously one of the most interesting things about the character is, the fight of control, and to see that, he already is subduing these Vulcan emotions, these very strong, passionate Vulcan emotions, but he also has to deal with these human emotions that he has. It's a twofold problem. It's a really interesting thing. See, because like I said, Vulcans, they do actually have emotions, and they can be very emotional and very passionate people. And it was the purging of these emotions that really elevated their society to the level that it reached. It was a very brutal society. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But once they started embracing these teachings, this is when they became this enlightened race and purged logic and purged emotion and had only logic at the core of their beliefs. Now, we don't get to see a lot of this bullying happening. We do see a little bit of it in the animated Star Trek TV show. It's supposedly not canon, so we can't take that as it really happened, but we see a little bit there. And in the new J.J. Abrams reboot, we really get a sense of, if we go by that, the bullying that Spock had to endure. And it's very moving to see the emotion just well up in this young Spock. They're making fun of him because of his mother and his father, mother being human, father being Vulcan, and they're just taunting him to try to get him to show emotion. And that's the interesting thing, right? These kids aren't supposed to have emotion, but they are definitely taking great pleasure in seeing him sort of trying to repress that anger and that emotion until it finally explodes. It's quite a moving scene. So we don't get a lot of Spock's life back on Vulcan, but we do learn in one of the later episodes, and probably one of the best well-known episodes of the original series, that when Spock was young, at around the age of 7, he was joined telepathically with a young Vulcan girl named T'Pring. Now, this telepathic bonding is really like a long egg timer for Vulcans. See, Vulcans have to reproduce, and this bonding in time will bring on what's known as Ponfar, which is a powerful drive to mate with whom you're bonded with. Now, if a Vulcan ignores Ponfar, it is fatal. So Spock has to be brought back to Vulcan, where he can supposedly mate with T'Pring. Unfortunately, T'Pring has other things in mind. Spock's been away, she's fallen in love, and through some tricky maneuvering and a Mickey that Bones administers to Kirk, who he has to fight, Spock is freed from his bond, and she chooses to mate with another, the one she's wanted all along. So Spock is off the hook. Now, one of the other things we known about Spock back when he was younger is that Spock didn't want to join the Vulcan Science Academy, even though it was what his father Sarek wanted. Spock did get an appointment, but he turned it down and instead joined Starfleet as the first cadet from Vulcan. Now, this caused a huge rift in the relationship between the father and son, and they had a tense, if not non-existent relationship for over 18 years. Now, he excelled in Starfleet and was given the rank of lieutenant aboard the USS Enterprise under Christopher Pike and served as his science officer. Now, I'm going to go a little bit out of order here, and I'm going to start with the pilot. And I know that sounds weird, but in Star Trek, the pilot, the original pilot, we never got to see till much later in the series. The original pilot was never aired in its entirety until much, much later on. But we're going to get to that in a minute. Now, in the pilot, Spock serves as Pike's junior science officer, and we meet him when the Enterprise intercepts a distress call from Talos 4, and it's here where the landing party comes up against the Talosians, whom capture Pike and try to convince him through the use of real ultra-real illusions that he needs to stay there, that he needs to help them. Now, one thing that I remember about this episode, of course, this is the first time we're meeting Spock, and he's very loud, and he's on the bridge, he's yelling, he's on the bridge, red alert, and he's just yelling these things, and he always seems to be shouting. And another thing about that episode that I always think of, and I'll actually put the picture of this in the show notes, is that they're on the planet and there's some plant that's making a weird kind of neat noise, and when he touches it, it stops, and he just smiles, beaming at Pike, looks very happy, which of course, is one of the last times we'll ever see that happening, other than some of the times on the Next Gen when they give him emotion for some reason or another. So the Talosians, they capture Pike, and what they really need him to do is teach them how to really live, because they really are very cerebral creatures who, don't really know how to, they don't know how to live. They don't know how to rebuild things. So they need his help. And the landing party actually, in the end, frees Pike and they leave Talos. Now, if this episode sounds familiar, it's because we got to see all of that as a 2-part episode called The Menagerie. The original actual pilot was called The Cage, and that's what The Menagerie is. It's cut up sections of The Cage that they called The Menagerie and did a 2-parter. Now, see, the network, way back in the beginning, by Gene Roddenberry, they were promised gun smoke in space. Shoot 'em up, action. Well, that's not what they got. Now, the Cage, again, the original pilot, that was very trippy, very cerebral. Definitely not Gunsmoke in space, so they shelved it. But, the powers that be, they liked the idea still for the show, and they gave Roddenberry another chance and let them do another pilot. Now, the new pilot was named Where No Man Has Gone Before, and it was very Gunsmoke in space. A lot of fights, lots of testosterone, a huge phaser rifle, and it's actually one of my favorites. It's just a great episode. And it's always nice to see the actor who played Poole in 2001: A Space Odyssey. I'm blanking on his name. If you remember, go ahead and put it in the notes. But he's actually playing the part of Gary, the main character in the Star Trek. So it's interesting because I haven't seen him in a lot, and then to see him in two sort of iconic sci-fi franchises was pretty cool. So when Roddenberry got the nod to do another pilot, there were some problems. One of the major problems was Christopher Pike was demanding more money, so he was dropped actually as the captain and was replaced by William Shatner. And it's kind of interesting if you think about it because, of course, Shatner's character was James T. Kirk, and they really could have just called him Christopher Pike, really, and gotten, no one knew about this other pilot. It was never technically going to be seen, but they went ahead and they created a whole new character and really changed the character quite a bit. Christopher Pike, his character is definitely not James T. Kirk's character. So it was neat that they not only, rewrote the story, but they came up with a new plot, but they sort of worked on the characters quite a bit as well. Now, there were only a few characters that really made it from the transition to the new pilot, and Spock was one of them. He was a fan favorite right off the bat, and Roddenberry's favorite as well, or one of his favorites, and he really wanted him to be a part of the show. Now, the character was smoothed out a bit, a lot less yelling, more cool logic, not a lot of smiling. Again, there are some times in the original series where there's a spore or some kind of weird virus thing that makes him have emotions, but usually he's very cool, very logical, very reasonable through the entire show. Now, one of the other characters that was brought over was Majel Barrett. Now, she played number 1 and the first pilot, but when they went to remake it, of course, NBC rejected the idea of a woman as a second in command, which is totally gross, but that's how it was. Things were like that back then, and a little bit right now, unfortunately. So Barrett was cast, though, actually, in the new pilot and throughout the series as Christine Chapel in the new Star Trek, and she is also Lwaxana Troi in Star Trek The Next Generation and Deep Space Nine, wherever Lwaxana shows up. So that was pretty neat. And really, technically, she is in all of the series because hers is the voice of the computer system. So whenever you hear the computer system, it's really Christine Chapel, it's really number 1, it's really Lwaxana Troi, and it's also Gene Roddenberry's wife. That's right, because Barrett and Roddenberry were husband and wife. So Spock made the cut, and he also got a promotion up to First Officer and Chief Science Officer. So now he's Kirk's right-hand man, and it's a great pairing. He's the cool, logical man of science, and of course his best friend Kirk is anything but. He's pretty much the exact opposite, by the guts and emotional, but these two are friends. Now, we technically meet Spock in the Star Trek episode The Man Trap, which was actually the first aired program of the season. First season, it was called The Man Trap. Now, not a very good episode, but again, hey, this was the first Star Trek, and it's definitely worth a watch. It's very McCoy or Bone-centric, but we get to meet all the major players. Now, throughout this series, we get to learn more and more about Spock and the Vulcan people. Now, Spock is known for his logic, but he has a few tricks up his sleeve. The Vulcan people have, through concentration and meditation, honed their minds to be able to do incredible things. A couple of the most notable, one being the Vulcan nerve pinch. Now, it was written into the script that Spock hits someone to subdue him, and Nimoy thought that the character just wouldn't do that. A Vulcan would not do that. So instead, Nimoy conceived of a maneuver where applying pressure to nerve points on someone's neck and sending or projecting telepathic energy through his fingertips would subdue the assailant. So this was Nimoy's idea, and the nerve pinch was born. So the first time the nerve pinch was used was in the episode The Enemy Within, which was one of my favorite episodes, on a doppelganger of Kirk. Now, Shatner knew what Nimoy was going for, and when Nimoy applied the nerve pinch, Shatner really sold it. It was his reaction that really made the whole thing believable, and it's the one time where Shatner's overacting really helped the scene out. And now a quick word from our sponsor, and as always, our sponsor is Discount Comic Book Service, dcbservice.com. All your books, minimum 40% off. Some 50, some 75. Just amazing bundles. So what they'll do is they'll say like the DC Kids bundle, 50% off. So all the DC Kids books that are coming out that month, 50% off. The new Marvel Monsters Unleashed, it's 50% off. So let's see, I'm going on the site right now. Let's click through here. What do we got? All DC Marvel hardcovers, trades, including Rebirth, 50% off. So all trades, 50% off. DC Universe Rebirth bundles, 1, 2, 3, 4, and number 4, 50% off. So these are 50, DC new miniseries, the Young Vertigo Animal series, 50% off bundles, 50% off the Marvel Now bundle. You can get them in bundles, you can get separate ones. I've been using these guys forever. They mail you your books. They're in perfect condition. Let's see, there's one on the site right here I just noticed. What is this? The All-Star Batman, number 6, an amazing book. It sells for $4.99, DCBS $2.99. So I'm looking at my order sheet for this month because I fill out an Excel sheet and I just upload it to their site, pay them, and they send me the books. My original order was, scroll down, was $89. And I'm going to be paying $50, $55. Quite a bit less. So again, that has to do with some are 50% off, some are 40, some are 75. Check them out. Great deals. dcbservice.com. Another ability that Spock can employ to aid in missions is the Vulcan Mind Meld. The Mind Meld is a unique technique where two minds become one and thoughts and emotions are shared. Now, it can be used as a way to communicate or commune with an individual, or if needed, as an interrogation technique. Now, of course, Spock being peaceful and being a Vulcan, he doesn't want to use it for these types of methods, but he has been known to. Now, there have been two that stick out in my head. There were the one where Spock is melding with a Horta. It's sort of like a creature that is intelligent and is sentient, but doesn't have the communication skills or methods we have. And he melds with this and is able to, it's actually silicone-based life form, and is able to sort of glean what this creature is all about. And the other is in the movie Undiscovered Country, which is one of the better Star Trek movies, where Spock has to interrogate Vulcan Lieutenant Valeris, who's actually played by Kim Cattrall, and he needs to get information from her, and he's also feeling a little bit betrayed by her because he sort of was her mentor, and he applies this mind meld, and at one point she just screams out, it's not even a scream, it's almost guttural, in pain by it. And both of them, when they're done, look visibly shaken. So the mind meld could be used for something for peace, to share ideas, and it can also be used as an amount of interrogation. And those are two really of the big things that the Vulcan can employ, not to mention the fact that Vulcans are a lot stronger than us. They have greater stamina than us. They are a pretty robust race. Now, if we look at some of the more notable moments in the development of the character, one of them that sort of sticks in my head are when we first meet the Romulans in the episode The Balance of Terror, which again is just a fantastic episode. And if I remember correctly, the bad Romulan in it will end up being the actor who will play Sarek, will end up being the actor who plays Spock's father, which is interesting. He isn't, because he dies in the end, but I think it's the same actor, if I remember correctly. Now, in this episode, The Balance of Terror, we learn, like everyone else on the Enterprise, that Romulans and Vulcans share a common ancestry, but they split during the time of the Awakening. And this is when Vulcans went the way of peace and logic, and Romulans went the way of passion, emotion, and power. We hadn't, I say we as in the Federation at that time, hadn't come in contact with Romulans in centuries. So only really the Vulcans knew this, and they sort of kept this close to their vest. Now, this was a revelation, however, to the members of the Enterprise, since, the Federation, they hadn't had any contact. They didn't know what these people looked like, and here they are. They look just like their first officer. And it was interesting to see how people started looking differently at Spock at this point when they realized he looked like the enemy. And they really played with some really interesting social ideas, and it's one of the really cool things that Star Trek did, which was examining social issues of the time and using science fiction as a metaphor. So he looks like the enemy, so can he be trusted? He, of course, can be and proves himself, but it's a fantastic episode, and it's one on my probably top 10 favorites. Now, another moment in his development, I guess if you could call it development, was, of course, the character's death in the amazing movie The Wrath of Khan, where Spock sacrifices himself to save the crew and then utters that classic line, "The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or the one." Now, he dies in this movie, and it was pretty touching. The funniest thing, though, what I remember about this is I saw this, at Sangertown Mall with a couple buddies of mine when it came out, and there was a line of waiting to get in to the next show. And one of my friends, who could be a bit of a tool, to put it nicely, as we're walking out and walking down the line of these people, all he keeps saying is, "Spock dies, Spock dies, Spock dies." I didn't know if we were going to get out of there alive. These people were ticked off. But that's one of the things I remember about seeing that movie with them. But of course, he doesn't stay dead, and he's resurrected in the next movie when the Genesis effect that went off in The Wrath of Khan actually brings him in and onto the planet that was created. And as the planet grows and becomes filled with life, it regenerates him, it brings him back to life, and as the planet starts to decay and die, he ages. So we get to see him grow and age. We see a young Spock all the way up to the Spock that we pretty much left in the last movie. So it was a really interesting movie. It had some serious problems to it, especially after such an amazing Wrath of Khan movie, but the whole Spock being brought back was obviously well worth it. And that is really, unfortunately for me, where the films really start to go downhill. One of the bright spots being The Voyage Home, which is actually, and incidentally, was directed by Nimoy. But that can be debated, as a lot of people didn't care for that one either. It is one that I still enjoy. And I have a lot of love-hate relationship with these movies. Now, I love Star Trek. Like I said, it's my favorite sci-fi franchise. But the movies have really been hit or miss. Again, it's interesting to see the characters grow. Spock go from, the original series, first officer, and then through the movies to be in command. And of course, also when Kirk's on board, though he's not, he goes ahead and sits back and is the science officer. So it is fun to see that. Of course, the films, the next gen crew take over. And in my opinion, the movies, I'm sorry, they just get worse. I love the Next Gen show, but the movies, I don't know, they just didn't do it for me. I think there was one or two that were okay, and there was a few at the end that I didn't even bother watching, and it hurt not to watch them because, again, I love Star Trek, but it just didn't do it for me. Now, going back to the original series, another point I used to enjoy was the relationship between Nurse Chapel and Spock. Remember, these were two actors that actually made it over from the original pilot, Nimoy being Spock and Barrett becoming Nurse Chapel. Well, Nurse Chapel had the hots for Spock and finally admitted it in the episode The Naked Time, where the crew were infected with a virus that stripped them of their inhibitions. Now, they had a few encounters, but of course nothing comes of it, and Spock always fights it, and I always wish that they maybe have gotten together. Now, of course, it isn't something that couldn't happen. Sarek and Amanda, the human and Vulcan. I always thought that, unfortunately for Spock, that since he had this human side, he had to think of himself and portray himself as being like the ultra Vulcan and not give in to anything. Even though Vulcans marry, Vulcans, they don't say they fall in love, but the other person is mutually agreeable, that type of thing. So he could have gotten with her, but of course, they never did. Now, of course, in the new Kelvin timeline, Spock does have a love interest, but it's actually with Uhura. And that is actually a good segue into the new Star Trek reboot series that's been spearheaded by J.J. Abrams. Now, actually, wait, can you call it a good segue if you have to call it out that it's a segue? Well, I'm going to keep it. It's a segue. So in this new reboot, Abrams takes a bold step and essentially replaces the original Star Trek timeline with an alternate timeline due to a time-traveling Romulan who has a grudge against Spock. So, see, in the future of the standard timeline, so the timeline we know, Spock was an ambassador and he was very effective. And he actually brokered the peace between the Federation and the Klingons. But later in his career, he was on a mission to save the Romulan home planet, the Romulan world, from utter destruction by a supernova. Unfortunately, he failed and did not make it there in time, and Romulus was completely destroyed. Now, there was a mining ship that was out of the system, and it was carried through time by the explosion, and this captain, Nero, hated Spock. So he was trying to get to the point using time travel to find when Spock was blown back through time, because when he was caught in the supernova, his ship was blown back. So he was trying to find Spock to take his revenge. Now, unfortunately, in coming back in time, he didn't do it right at the right time, and he came across the USS Kelvin. And he destroys that ship. He's not quite sure what time he's in, and comes across the Kelvin and takes their captain captive, and then goes about to destroy the ship. Now, unfortunately, on board the USS Kelvin are Kirk's parents, his father and his mother. But here's this: his mother is pregnant with him. So, unfortunately, the father, Jim's father, sacrifices himself and dies when he crashes his ship into Nero's ship, which doesn't really do anything. But in doing this, the mother and Kirk, unborn Kirk, survive. Now, right when you see this, when you watch this movie, you're like, wait, it didn't happen this way. Kirk's dad is alive. He's got a brother. Something is wrong here. And that sets in motion really these events in Kirk's life in this new Kelvin timeline that are much different than in the timeline we're familiar with. So Nero does find Spock's ship, and that was washed back through time. And to take his ultimate revenge, Nero captures him, puts him on a planet, leaves him there so he can see Vulcan. And then Nero actually destroys Vulcan and everyone on that planet, including Spock's mother. So we see the timeline is changing radically. Kirk and Spock are not friends. Kirk is taking control of the Enterprise way too early. Spock's mother is dead. Vulcan is destroyed with millions or billions of Vulcans. It's a much different timeline. There's so many differences, it's really hard to even go through them all. Now, the really cool thing is, though, and some people don't think this, of course, the really cool thing is now there are two Spocks at the end of this movie. We've got old Spock that we know, and we've got the new Spock from the reboot. And I have to say, a lot of people will disagree with this, but I love this reboot. Everything is fresh. The characters are new but the same. The actors just nail it. I mean, the guy who plays Bones is just incredible. And I'm always amazed when I read comments that just people hate these movies. they're just as action-packed as the old shows were. The characters are tack on. I actually read something on Facebook where someone was like, what has Abrams done to James T. Kirk? He's turned him into a womanizing loudmouth who just runs off and does anything he pleases by his gut. And I'm like, hello, that's what he was on the TV show. But a lot of people don't like them. I'm not sure why. I think they're fantastic. And they always say that they destroyed the show and ruined it. And again, I've never understood that because the original is still there. Just go on Netflix. You can watch all of them. So now the cool thing is we have 2 Spocks. And that is just awesome. Now, one piece of fun I learned in doing the research is that Leonard Nimoy, had approval over who was cast as Spock for the reboot. And he was very pleased with the choice of Zach Quinto, who just does a fantastic job as Spock. All the actors in these reboots do. Also, Nimoy had thought he was done with acting, but he read the script for the reboot and he thought it was something he really wanted to do. So he went back in to sort of do these new reboots. And actually, as a fringe benefit, Abrams got Nimoy to do some work on his awesome TV show, Fringe, as the sort of bad guy, good guy, William Bell. And again, if you haven't watched Fringe, watch it. I'm not sure if it's on Netflix anymore. You might have to check it out on maybe Hulu or Amazon, but Fringe is awesome. Now, unfortunately, Leonard Nimoy has passed away. A lot of people might not know he was an amazing director, but he was an amazing photographer. If you get a chance, do a Google search to look up some of his photographs. He had an incredible eye. And, this character, again, it's one more Star Trek actor, Star Trek character that we'll never see again on the screen in anything new. So to me, it was fantastic to get these reboots to see the character again. And again, just doing this podcast, it reminded me of his photography, and I went back and looked through quite a bit of it. And I'll actually add a link to some of his sites in the show notes. He was just everything I've read about him, and I of course read his book, I'm Spock. He just seemed like an all around good guy. Now, if we jump back to the movies really quick, in the last movie, Star Trek Beyond, Zach Quinto, he's the actor who plays the new Spock in the Abrams reboot. He actually learns that the elder Spock has died, of course, because Leonard Nimoy has died. This is it's a very touching moment. And in hearing this, Quinto, Spock, he decides to quit Starfleet and continue Ambassador Spock's work on New Vulcan, because they've formed a new planet, New Vulcan, and old Spock, our Spock, has been working there because he can be in 2 places at once now, right? He can be in Starfleet and helping Vulcans. So he's going to decide he's going to leave. Quinto's going to leave and he's going to help out the New Vulcan. But he actually receives a package from the elder Spock and with some mementos. And in it, it's really sweet. There's a photo in it. And it's taken from the original series movies, and it's from the Undiscovered Country that has the entire cast in it. And it's just amazing to see this, that he's, there it is. There's this picture with the original cast in this reboot. And it was very touching. And, in seeing it, Spock decides to stay in Starfleet. Now, I can only hope there's going to be more of these Star Trek movies. I'm not sure if Abrams is going to be doing the next one. But if you haven't seen them, they're definitely worth watching, especially if you're a Star Trek fan. Watch them with an open mind. Watch them as just another retelling of the story. They're really good, and I'm trying to always preach that these movies are worth watching. Because you can't beat it, right? We get young Spock, we get old Spock, 2 Spocks for the price of 1. And again, I want to let everyone know that I'm working on a video that shows how I put the episodes together. There's one up there right now, and I'll be putting another one up after the holidays that'll cover some more of the steps. And I think I'm almost done editing them all. It looks like there's going to be about 6 of them. And I'll be sure to tell you through the cast and through our Facebook page. Check us out on Facebook. A lot of likes over there. It's going really fun. So you can check that out. And again, I want to thank you for listening to this episode of the Heroes, Villains, and Sidekicks show. Our theme music is by Broke for Free, and you can find links to other music from the show on our website, heroesvillainsandsidekicks.com. And there you can listen to the show, but better yet, head over to iTunes and subscribe. And even better, leave a review. Now, I know there's some people listening out there. If you have a minute, leave a review over at iTunes. It would really help us out. We have one review, and it's not a good one. And it's because of a mistake I had made early on when I named this show exactly like another show. And it was, if you listen to one of the other podcasts where I explain this, I made a bonehead play. I didn't go ahead and check to see if there was another show out there called what I named it, Heroes and Villains Podcast, which is a great podcast. And I went ahead and changed the name. Unfortunately, someone left a pretty funny review, but not a good review. So some good reviews would really help us out, and I would really appreciate it. Now, if you have any recommendations or other characters you'd want to hear on the show, you can go ahead and send an email. You can leave a comment over at the site. And actually, there's a little form on the homepage now that you can just put in the character you'd like to see, a little comment. Put your name in there if you want. You don't have to. And I'll, tell your name on the air and tell me say what character that you chose. I think it was the Batgirl episode was one that, no, it wasn't Batgirl. It was the Black Cat episode. Someone had actually emailed in, and boom, that was up there that next week. So if you want to hear about someone, go ahead and use the site for that. But again, please leave a review. Now, we'll be back next week with more. Have a great holiday and take care.